night was pitch black, and the wind howled through the mountains as the old train wound its way along the narrow tracks. William, the train driver, had been on this route hundreds of times, but tonight felt different. The weather was worse than usual, and the radio crackled with intermittent static, cutting off any communication with the outside world. William was alone in the cab, the dim light from the controls casting long shadows across the walls. The train was an old coal locomotive, its massive engine rumbling like a beast as it hauled the heavy cars through the treacherous terrain. The tracks twisted and turned through the mountains, with steep drops on either side. William kept his eyes fixed on the track ahead, his hands gripping the controls tightly. The flickering lights inside the cab only added to the eerie atmosphere. As the train rounded a particularly sharp bend, something caught William's eye movement in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the headlight. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, a result of his tired mind playing games with him, but the unease lingered. The train continued its journey, the rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the tracks providing a constant backdrop. William glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. The darkness outside was absolute, with only the faint glow from the train's headlights cutting through the night. The mountains loomed on either side, their jagged peaks lost in the inky blackness. Suddenly, the train jerked, and the lights flickered. William's heart skipped a beat as he fought to keep the train steady on the tracks. The controls seemed to resist his efforts, and the engine groaned as if under some immense strain. The radio crackled again, this time with a low, almost inhuman sound that sent a shiver down his spine. William tried to radio the control center, but all he got was static. The unease that had been gnawing at him all night began to turn into fear. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The train was slowing down, despite his efforts to keep it moving. It felt as if something was holding it back, pulling it into the shadows. He looked out the window, and his blood ran cold. Shapes were moving in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the headlights. They were formless, shifting, almost like smoke, but with an ominous presence that he could feel deep in his bones. The shadows seemed to be alive, creeping closer with each passing second. William's hand shook as he tried to increase the throttle, but the train only slowed further. The shadows were closing in, and the temperature in the cab dropped suddenly, turning his breath into visible puffs of steam. Panic gripped him as the radio let out a distorted, guttural noise that sent a wave of terror through him. The train came to a grinding halt. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of William's ragged breathing. He could hear his heart pounding in his chest as he stared out into the darkness. The shadows were everywhere now, swirling around the train like a living entity. He felt a presence behind him, something cold and malevolent. Slowly, he turned, and his worst fears were realized. The shadows had seeped into the cab, twisting and writhing in the dim light. They took on a vaguely human shape, their featureless faces staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. William backed away, his body trembling with fear. He reached for the emergency brake, but before he could pull it, the shadows surged forward, enveloping him. The cold was unbearable, seeping into his very soul. He tried to scream, but no sound came out as the darkness swallowed him whole. The last thing William saw was the flickering lights of the cab, dimming as the shadows consumed everything in their path. The train, now completely still, sat in the darkness, its driver lost to the void. When the rescue team finally reached the train the next morning, they found it abandoned on the tracks, the engine still running. The cab was empty, and there was no sign of William. The only evidence of his presence was the faint outline of his handprint on the frosted window, frozen in a final, desperate attempt to escape. The shadows had claimed him, leaving nothing but an empty train and an unanswered mystery. The old coal train continued its route, but no one ever spoke of what had happened that night. The story was whispered among the other drivers, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk in the dark. And as for William, he became just another shadow, lost in the night, waiting for the next train to come along. The old coal train creaked and groaned as it moved slowly through the dark, remote countryside. It was a relic from another era, with its rusted exterior and soot-stained walls. The train was mostly empty, with only a few passengers scattered throughout the dimly lit carriages. The air inside was thick with the smell of coal and metal, a constant reminder of the train's long history. Among the passengers was a man named Victor. He was traveling alone, seated in a small compartment near the back of the train. Victor was a quiet man, keeping to himself as he watched the dark landscape pass by through the grimy window. The train moved at a steady pace, the rhythmic clanking of the wheels on the tracks the only sound that broke the silence. As the night wore on, the train passed through increasingly isolated areas. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the only light came from the dim bulbs that flickered occasionally in the carriage. Victor noticed that the train was almost completely deserted. He hadn't seen another passenger in hours. The conductor, a stern-looking man with a weary expression, had made his rounds earlier, but even he had disappeared. The sense of isolation began to gnaw at Victor. The silence inside the train was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the metal as the train wound its way through the hills. Victor shifted in his seat, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over him. Suddenly, the train jerked violently, causing Victor to lurch forward in his seat. The train began to slow down, the screeching of the brakes echoing through the carriage. Victor looked out the window, but all he could see was darkness. The train came to a halt in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but the empty night. Victor's unease turned to fear. He had heard stories about this old train, rumors that it was cursed, that strange things happened to those who traveled on it alone. He tried to dismiss the thoughts, telling himself that they were just superstitions, but the fear continued to grow. As the minutes passed, the silence became unbearable. Victor decided to leave his compartment and find the conductor, hoping to get some answers. He stepped out into the narrow, dimly lit corridor, his footsteps echoing eerily as he made his way through the carriage. The other compartments were empty, their doors slightly ajar, revealing dark, silent spaces. Victor continued down the corridor, his heart pounding in his chest. The air grew colder as he approached the next carriage, and he felt a chill run down his spine. As he reached the door to the next carriage, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. Something was wrong, he could feel it. Taking a deep breath, Victor pushed open the door and stepped into the next carriage. The air was thick with the smell of coal and something else, something metallic. The dim light flickered as he made his way down the narrow aisle. Halfway through the carriage, Victor stopped, dead in his tracks. There, slumped in one of the seats, was the conductor. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and his throat had been slit. Blood pooled on the floor beneath him, its dark color barely visible in the dim light. Victor felt his stomach turn as he realized what he was looking at, a murder. Panic set in as Victor backed away, his mind racing. Who could have done this? Was the killer still on the train? He had to get out, had to find help. He turned to leave, but as he did, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Victor froze, his heart pounding in his ears. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. He didn't dare turn around. He knew that if he did, he would come face to face with the murderer. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Victor felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He knew he had to run, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The voice chuckled, a sound that sent chills down his spine. It's too late, you know. There's nowhere to go. Summoning all his courage, Victor turned and bolted for the door. He didn't look back as he ran through the carriages, his only thought to escape the train and the horror that now haunted it. The train was still stationary, its cold, metal body looming in the dark like a tomb. Victor reached the door to the last carriage and threw it open. He could see the tracks stretching out into the darkness, disappearing into the night. Without hesitation, he jumped from the train, landing hard on the cold ground. He scrambled to his feet and began running along the tracks, the cold air burning in his lungs. Behind him, the train remained still, its windows dark and empty. The only sound was the wind howling through the trees. Victor ran until he couldn't run anymore, his heart pounding in his chest, his body shaking with fear. The next morning, the authorities found the train, still parked on the tracks. Inside, they discovered the conductor's body and a second, unknown victim. There was no sign of Victor, and no trace of the killer. The train was towed back to the station, where it was locked away, a relic of a time long past. But the story of the midnight train and the murderer who stalked its carriages would live on, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks in the most unexpected places. A late December snowstorm intensified, covering the remote countryside in a thick, suffocating blanket of white. Anna and David, a young couple who had been together for 3 years but were not yet married, were on a long train journey to visit David's parents for the holidays. It was supposed to be a joyful occasion, their first Christmas together as a couple. But as the snow fell relentlessly outside, their excitement gradually turned into a growing sense of unease. The train had been moving steadily through the snowy landscape, the rhythmic clattering of wheels on the tracks a constant companion. But as the storm grew worse, the train began to slow. The engine's steady hum faltered, and within moments, the train came to a complete stop. Anna looked out the window, but all she could see was darkness and snow swirling in the wind. The outside world had disappeared, swallowed up by the blizzard. The train remained still for what felt like an eternity. There were no announcements, no signs of life from the train crew. The only sound was the howling wind outside, a chilling reminder of the harsh conditions they were now trapped in. The heating system, already struggling against the freezing temperatures, began to fail. Cold air seeped into their compartment, and Anna pulled her coat tighter around her, trying to keep the cold at bay. Hours passed with no explanation. The silence inside the train was unsettling, broken only by the occasional creak of the metal as it settled in the cold. The frost on the windows grew thicker, obscuring what little view they had of the outside world. The temperature inside the compartment continued to drop, and Anna began to shiver uncontrollably. As the night wore on, the realization began to sink in they were completely alone. The other compartments remained eerily quiet, as if the entire train had been abandoned. The thought was unsettling, gnawing at the edges of their sanity. Anna tried to convince herself that the crew was just busy, that someone would come soon, but as time passed, that hope began to fade. The cold became a relentless force, sapping their strength and will to move. The once cozy compartment had turned into a freezing tomb. Anna's thoughts grew darker, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if they were stuck here for days? What if no one came to rescue them? The idea of freezing to death in this remote, desolate place seemed all too real. David, usually the more practical of the two, tried to stay calm, but even he could not hide his growing fear. He checked his phone, but there was no signal. They were completely cut off from the outside world. The train's communication system seemed to be down as well, with no way to contact the conductor or anyone else on board. Desperation set in as the hours dragged on. They tried banging on the compartment door, calling out for help, but there was no response. The oppressive silence inside the train was only broken by the howling wind outside, a constant reminder of the brutal conditions they were facing. As the night wore on, they began to notice strange things. The train, which had once been filled with the noise of other passengers and the sounds of movement, was now eerily quiet. It was as if they were the only ones left. They searched the other compartments, but found them all empty, as if the passengers had simply vanished into thin air. The cold continued to intensify, their breaths now visible in the frigid air. The once comforting warmth of their coats was no match for the freezing temperatures that gripped the train. Anna's hands and feet were numb, her body trembling with cold and fear. David tried to keep her spirits up, but even he was struggling to maintain hope. They returned to their compartment, huddling together for warmth, trying to fend off the cold that threatened to consume them. The frost on the windows was now so thick that they could no longer see outside. The darkness felt oppressive, the walls of the compartment closing in on them. The train remained still, buried under the relentless onslaught of snow, as if it had been swallowed whole by the storm. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each minute feeling like an hour. The cold gnawed at their bodies, sapping their strength and will to move. Anna and David were now in survival mode, doing whatever they could to stay warm. But as the hours passed, it became clear that their situation was dire. The cold was too intense, the isolation too complete. They were miles from anywhere, trapped in a frozen wilderness with no hope of escape. As the first light of dawn began to break through the storm, it was clear that the night had taken its toll. Their bodies were weak, their minds numb from the cold and fear. The train, once a symbol of their holiday joy, had become a tomb, buried under the weight of the snow and the crushing realization that they were alone, forgotten in the vast, frozen wilderness. The day brought no relief. The snowstorm continued unabated, and the train remained still, as if it had become a permanent part of the landscape. The cold was unrelenting, and as the hours dragged on, they realized that they were not going to make it out alive. The cold would claim them, just as it had claimed the train and everything else in its path. In their final moments, as the cold closed in and their bodies began to shut down, they held each other close, trying to find some comfort in the face of the inevitable. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, there was only silence. The train, once a vessel of hope and excitement, had become a monument to their last, desperate moments. And then, as the cold finally claimed them, the storm began to die down. The train remained buried in the snow, a silent witness to the fate of those who had been caught in its grip. The wind quieted, the snow stopped falling, and the world outside returned to its serene, white stillness. But the train, and those who had perished inside, would remain forever frozen in time. A chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk in the most unexpected places.